Chapter 21 of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood. Chapter 21. How we were lighted on our way down the dark and silent river. Sudden and fierce onslaught upon our beautiful boat of shell. A fight for life against terrible odds, and how Bulger stood by me through it all. Cold air and lumps of ice. Our entry into the cavern whence they came. The boat of shell comes to the end of its voyage. Sunlight in the world within a world, and all about the wonderful window through which it poured, and the mysterious land it lighted. I dare say, dear friends, that you are puzzling your brains to think out how it was possible for me to row away from the wonderful city of the Formifolk without running our boat continually ashore. Ah, you forget that the keen-eyed Bulger was at the helm, and that it was not the first time that he had piloted me through darkness impenetrable to my eyes. But more than this, I soon discovered that the plashing of my silver oars kept my little friends, the fire lizards, in a constant state of alarm, and although I couldn't hear the crackling of their tails, yet the tiny flashes of light served to outline the shore admirably. So I pulled away with a will, and down this dark and silent river, for there was a current, although hardly perceptible. Bulger and I were borne along in the beautiful bark of tortoiseshell, with its prow of carved and burnished silver. During my sojourn in the land of the Soodopsies, I had one day, while calling upon the learned Barrelbrow, noticed a beautifully carved silver hand lamp of the Pompeian pattern among his curiosities. I asked him if he knew what it was. He replied that he did, adding that it had doubtless been brought from the upper world by his people, and he begged me to accept it as a keepsake. I did so, and upon leaving the city of silver I filled it with fish oil and fitted a silken wick to it. It was well that I had done so, for after a while the fire lizards disappeared entirely, and Bulger and I would have been left in total darkness had I not drawn forth my beautiful silver lamp, lighted it, and suspended it from the beak of the silver swan which curved its graceful neck above the bow of our boat. After lying on my oars long enough to set some food before Bulger and partake of some myself, I again started on my voyage down the silent river, no longer shrouded in impenetrable gloom. I had not taken over half a dozen strokes when suddenly one of my oars was almost twisted out of my hand by a vicious tug from some inhabitant of these dark and sluggish waters. I resolved to quicken my stroke in order to escape another such a wrench, for the silver oars fashioned by the Soodopsies for me were a very delicate make, intended only for very gentle usage. Suddenly another vicious snap was made at my other oar, and this time the animal succeeded in retaining its hold, for I dared not attempt to wrench the oar out of its grip for fear of breaking it. It was a large crustacean of the crab family, and its milk-white shell gave it a ghost-like look as it struggled about in the black waters, fiercely intent to keep its hold upon the oar. The next instant a similar creature had fastened firmly upon my other oar, and there I sat utterly helpless. But worse than this, the dark waters were now fairly alive with these white-armored guards of this underworld stream, each apparently bent upon setting an immediate end to my progress through their domain. They now began a series of furious efforts to lay hold of the sides of my boat with their large claws, but happily its polished surface made this impossible for them to accomplish. Up to this moment, Bulger had not stirred a muscle or uttered a sound, but now a sharp growl from him told me that something serious had happened at his end of the boat. It was serious indeed, for several of the largest of the fierce crustaceans had laid hold of the rudder and were wrenching it from side to side as if to tear it off. Every attempt, of course, caused a tug at the tiller ropes held between Bulger's teeth, but, bracing himself firmly, he resisted their furious efforts as well as he could, and succeeded in saving the rudder for the time being. All of a sudden, our frail bark of shell crashed into some sort of obstruction, and came to a dead standstill. Peering into the darkness, to my horror, I saw that the wily enemy had spanned the river with chains made up of living links, by each laying hold of his neighbor's claw. the chain thus formed being then rendered almost as strong as steel by the interweaving of their double rows of small hooked legs. Our advance was not only blocked, but death, an awful death, seemed to be staring us in the face. For what possible hope of escape could there be if Bulger and I should leap into the water, now alive with these fast-swimming creatures, whirling their huge claws about in search for some way to get at us? From the brave manner in which Bulger was holding the madly swinging helm, I saw that he was determined not to surrender. But alas, bravery is but a sorry thing for two to fight 1,000 with. And yet I had not lost my head. Don't think that. True, I was hard pressed. The very dust of the balance, if thicker on their side, might make my scale kick the beam. I had hauled both oars into the boat by reaching over and beating off the claws fastened upon them, and had up to this moment driven back every one of the fierce creatures which had succeeded in throwing one of its claws over the edge of the boat. But now, to my horror, I felt that our little craft was being slowly but surely drawn stern first toward the river bank. In order to accomplish this, the crustaceans had thrown out a line composed of their bodies gripped together, and had made it fast to the rudder. Not an instant was to be lost. Once upon the river bank, the fierce creatures would swarm around us by the 10,000s, drag us down, pinch us to death, and tear us piecemeal. An idea flashed upon me. It was this. It is folly to attempt to resist these countless swarms of crustaceans by the use of one pair of weak hands, even though they be aided by Bulger's keen and willing teeth. We should, after a brief struggle, go down as the brave man in the sewer went down, when the famished rats leapt upon him from every side at once, or as the stray buffalo goes down when the pack of ravenous wolves closes up its circle about him. If I am to save my life, it must be by striking a blow that will reach every one of these small but fierce enemies at the same instant, and thus paralyze them, or at least bewilder them until I can succeed in making my escape. Quickly drawing my brace of pistols, I held their muzzles close to the water and discharged them at the same instant. The effect was terrific. Like a crash of a terrible thunderbolt, the report burst forth and echoed through these vast and silent chambers, until it seemed as if the great vaulted roof of rock had by some awful convulsion of nature been cast roaring and rattling down upon the face of these black and sluggish waters. When the smoke had cleared away, a strange but welcome sight met my gaze. Tens of thousands of the huge crabs floated lifeless upon the surface of the river, with their shells split by the concussion the full length of their bodies. It proved to have been a masterly stroke on my part, and, dear friends, you will believe me when I tell you that I drew a deep breath as I set my silver oars against the thole pins, and having worked my boat clear of the swarm of stunned crustaceans, rowed away for dear life. Dear life, ah yes, dear life, for whose life is not dear to him, even though it be dark and gloomy at times? Is there not always something or someone to live for? Is there not always a glimmer of hope that the morrow's sun will go up brighter than it did this morning? Well, anyway, I repeat that I rowed away for dear life, while Bulger held the tiller ropes and kept our frail bark of polished shell in the middle of the stream. Whether the air was actually colder, or whether it was merely the natural chill that so often strikes the human heart after it had been beating and throbbing with alternate hope and fear, I couldn't say at the time, but I knew this much, that I suddenly found myself suffering from the cold. For the first time since my descent into the world within a world, the air nipped my fingertips. That soft, balmy, June-like atmosphere was gone, and I made haste to put on my fur-trimmed topcoat, which I had not made much use of lately. At that moment one of my oars struck against some hard substance floating in the waters. I put out my hand to feel of it. To my great surprise it proved to be a lump of ice, and very soon another and another went floating by us. We were most surely entering a region where it was cold enough to make ice. I was not sorry for this, for to tell the truth, Bulger and I were both beginning to feel the effects of our long sojourn in the rocky chambers of this underworld, whose atmosphere, though soft and warm, yet lacked the elasticity of the open air. Ice caverns would be a complete change, and the cold air would no doubt send our blood tingling through our veins, just as if we were out a-sleighing in the upper world on a winter's night, when the stars twinkle over our heads and the snow crystals creak beneath our runners. Soon now huge icicles began to dot the roof of rock that spanned the river, and shafts and columns of ice dimly visible along the shore seemed to be standing there like silent sentries, watching our boat as it threaded its way through the ever narrowing channel. And now, too, a faint glow of light reached us from I knew not where, so that by straining my eyes I could see that the river had taken a sweep and entered a vast cavern with roof and walls of ice fretted and carved into fantastic depths, and niches and shelves and cornices, with here and there shapes so fanciful that it seemed to me I had entered some vast hall of statuary, where hero and warrior, nymph and maiden, shepherd and bird catcher filled these shelves and niches in glorious array. Farther advance by water was impossible, for the blocks of ice, knitted together like a floe, closed the river completely. I therefore determined to make a landing, draw my boat upon the shore, and continue my journey on foot. The mysterious light, which up to this moment had shed its pale glimmer like an arctic night upon the roofs and walls of ice of these silent chambers, now began to strengthen, so that Bulger and I had no difficulty in picking our way along the shore. In fact, we crossed and recrossed the river itself when the whim seized us, for it now went winding on ahead of us like a broad ribbon of ice through caverns and corridors. Suddenly I came to a halt, and stood as motionless as the fantastic forms of ice surrounding me. What could it mean? Were my eyes weakened by my long sojourn in the world within a world, playing me cruel tricks? Surely there can be no mistake, I whispered to myself. That light yonder, which pours its glorious effulgence upon those spires and pinnacles, those towers and turrets of ice, is the sunshine of the upper world. Can it be that my marvelous underground journey is ended, that I stand upon the threshold of the upper world once more? Bulger, too, recognizes this flood of sunshine, and breaking out into a fit of joyous barking, dashes on ahead to be the first one to feel its gentle warmth after our long journey through the dark and silent passages of the world within a world. But I dare not trust my eyes, and fearing lest he should fall into some ambush, or meet with some dread accident, I called him back to me. Together we hurry along as rapidly as possible. Now I note that we are drawing near to the end of the vast corridor through which we have been making our way for some time, and that we stand upon the portal of a mighty subterranean region lighted with real sunlight. It stretches away as far as the eye can reach, and so high is the roof that spans this vast underworld that I cannot see whether it be of ice or not. All that I can see is that through one of its sloping sides there streams a mighty torrent of sunlight, which pours its splendor with unstinting hand upon the wide highways, the broad terraces, the sheer parapets, and the sloping banks which diversify this ice world. Can it be that one side of this mighty mountain which nature has here hollowed out and set like a peaked roof over this vast subterranean region is a gigantic window of ice itself, through which the sunlight of the outer world streams in this grand way like a silent cataract of light, like a deluge of sunshine? No, this could not be. For now upon a second look I saw that this flood of light thus streaming through the side of the mountain came through it like a mighty pencil of rays, and striking the opposite walls with its brilliancy 100-fold increased, rebounded in 1,000 directions, flooding the whole region with its effulgence, and dying away in faint and pearl-like glimmer in the vast approach where I had first noted it. And therefore I understood that nature must have set a gigantic lens twice 1,000 feet or more in diameter in the sloping side of this hollow mountain, a perfect lens of purest rock crystal, which, in gathering in its mysterious bosom the sunlight of the outer world, threw it, intensely radiant and dazzling white, into the gloomy depths of this world within a world, so that when the sun went up out there, it went up in here as well, but became cold, as it was beautiful, bringing no warmth, no other cheer save light, to this subterranean region which for thousands of centuries had lain locked in the crystal embrace of frozen lakes and brooks and rivers, and torrents and waterfalls, once bubbling and flowing and rushing headlong through fair lands of the upper world, but suddenly checked in their course by some bursting forth of mighty pent-up forces, and turned downward into these icy depths, condemned to everlasting rest and silence. their crystals locked in a sleep that never would know an awakening, mocked in their dreams by this mysterious sunlight that came with the smile and the fair, winsome look of the real, and yet was so powerless to set them free, as once it did when the springtime came in the upper world. All these thoughts and many others besides flitted through my mind as I stood looking up at that mighty lens in its setting of mightier rock. And so deeply impressed was I by the sight of such a great flood of sunlight pouring through this gigantic bull's eye, which nature had set in the rocky side of the hollow mountain peak, and illuming this underworld, that the longer I gazed upon the wonderful spectacle, the more firmly enthralled my senses became by it. The deep silence, the deliciously pure air, the ever-varying tints of the light as the mighty ice columns, acting the part of prisms, literally filled those vast chambers with the rainbow's glorious glow, imparted unto the spell resting upon me such unearthly power that it might have held me there until my limbs hardened into icy crystals, and my eyes looked out with a frozen stare, had not the ever-watchful Bulger given a gentle tug at the skirt of my coat and aroused me from my enthralling meditation. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood. Chapter 22. The Palace of Ice in the Golden Sunlight, and what I imagined it might contain. How we were halted by a couple of quaintly clad sentinels. The Koltykwerps, His Frigid Majesty King Gelidus. More about the Ice Palace, together with a description of the throne room. Our reception by the king and his daughter Schneeboule. Brief mention of Bullabrain, or Lord Hothead. Scarcely had I advanced 100 yards beyond the portal where I had halted when happening to turn my eyes to the other side, a sight met them which sent a thrill of wonder and delight through my form. There upon the highest terrace stood a palace of ice, its slender minarets, its high lifted towers, its rounded turrets, its spacious platform, and its broad flights of steps all glittering in the sunlight, as if gem-studded and jewel-set. It was a spectacle to stir the most indifferent heart, let alone one so full of ardor and buoyancy as mine. But dear friends, even admitting that I can succeed in awakening in your minds even a faint conception of the beauty of this ice palace, as the sunlight fell full upon it at that moment, how can I ever hope to give you an idea of the unearthly beauty of this palace of ice and its glorious surroundings when the moon went up in the outer world at a later hour and its pale, mysterious light was poured through the mighty lens in the mountainside and fell with celestial shimmer upon these walls of ice? But the one thought that oppressed me now was, can this beautiful abode be without a tenant? Without a living soul within its wonderful halls and chambers? Or may not its dwellers, overtaken by the pitiless cold, sit with wide opened eyes and icy glare, stark as marble in chairs of ice, white frosted hair pressed against icy cushions, and hands stiffened around crystal cups filled with frozen wine of topaz hue, while the harper's fingers cling cramped to the wires stiff as the wires themselves, and the last tones of the singer's voice lie in feathery crystals of frozen breath white at his feet. Come what may, I resolved to lift the crystal knocker that might hang on the outer door of this palace of ice, and awaken the castellan, if his slumber were not that of death. In a few moments I had crossed the level space between me and the first terrace, which it would be necessary for me to scale in order to reach the second, and then the third, upon which stood the palace of ice. Imagine my more than surprise upon finding myself now at the foot of a magnificent flight of steps, hewn into the ice with a master hand, and leading to the terrace above. Springing lightly up this flight with Bulger close at my heels, I suddenly set eyes upon two of the quaintest looking human beings that I ever remembered seeing in all my travels. They looked for all the world like two big animated snowballs, being clad from top to toe in garments made of snow-white fleece, their skull-caps likewise of white fur, leaving only their faces visible. In his right hand each of them carried a very prettily shaped flint axe, mounted upon a helve of polished bone. Striding up to me and swinging their axes over my head in altogether too close proximity to my pole to be particularly pleasant, one of them cries out, "Halt, sir, unless his frigid majesty Gelidus, king of the Cullycorps, awaits thy coming. His guards will, at a signal from us, roll a few 1,000 tons of ice down upon thee, if thou darest proceed another step. Therefore, stand fast, and tell us who thou art, and whether thou art expected." "Gentlemen," said I, "kindly lower those axes of yours, and I will convince you that his frigid majesty hath nothing to dread in me, for I am none other than the very small, but very noble and very famous Sebastian von Trump, commonly known as the Little Baron." "Never heard of thee in all my life," said both of the guards, as with one voice. "But I have of you, gentlemen," I continued, for now I recollected what the learned Don Fum had said about the frozen land of the Cullycorps, or cold bodies, "and as proof of my peaceful intent, like a true knight, I now offer you my hand, and beg that you will conduct me into the presence of his frigid majesty." No sooner had the guard standing next to me drawn off his glove and grasped my hand than he let it loose again with a cry of fright. "Zounds, man, art thou on fire? Why, thy hand burned me like a flame of a lamp." "Why, no, my friend," I said quietly, "that's my ordinary temperature." "And thy companion?" "Hath even a warmer heart than I have," was my reply. "Well, our word for it, little Baron," exclaimed one of the guards with a chuckle, "there will be no place for thee except in the meat quarry. Possibly after thou hast been cooled off for a week or so, his frigid majesty will be able to have thee about." This was not a very cheerful prospect, for I had no particular desire to be laid away in the royal ice box for a week or so. Anyway, the only thing to be done was to insist upon being conducted at once into the presence of the king of the Cullycorps, and abide by his decision. One of the guards, having saluted me by presenting his battle axe in real military style, faced about and began to ascend the grand staircase, with intent to announce my arrival to his frigid majesty, while the other informed me that he would conduct me as far as the palace. I was wonderstruck with the beauty of the 3 staircases leading up to the ice palace. Massive balustrades with curiously carved balusters springing from towering pedestals, crowned with beautiful lamps, all I say, all and everything, to the crystal clear sides of the lamps themselves, was fashioned from blocks of ice. It proved to be a good climb to the top of the 3rd terrace, and I was not put out when the guard solemnly lowered his battle axe of flint to bring me to its standstill. The sun in the upper world was, no doubt, nearing the horizon, for a deep and beautiful twilight suddenly sank upon the icy dominions of King Gelidus, and to my surprise and delight, through the great slabs of crystal clear ice which served for windows to the palace, streamed a soft radiance, as if 1,000 wax tapers were burning in the chambers and galleries indoors. It was a sight to gladden the eyes of any mortal, but if I had been spellbound by the beauty of its exterior, how shall I tell you, dear friends, of the curious splendor of the interior of Gelidus's palace of ice, as it burst upon me when I had crossed its threshold? Hallway led into hallway, chamber opened into chamber, through portals gracefully arched and winding staircases climbing to upper rooms, while hanging from lofty ceilings or resting on graceful pedestals were 1,000 alabaster lamps, shedding light and perfume upon this glorious home of his frigid majesty Gelidus, king of the Cullycorps. Long rows of retainers, all in snow-white fur, lined the wide hallway as the guards conducted Bulger and me into the palace, and bowed in silence as we passed. To my more than wonder, I saw that the inner rooms were most sumptuously furnished, chairs and divans being scattered here and there, all covered with superb skins of white fur, while the floor too was carpeted with them, and as the soft radiance of the alabaster lamps fell upon these magnificent pelts, and set 10,000 jewels in the walls and ceilings of ice, I was ready to admit that I had never seen anything half so beautiful, and yet I was still outside the throne room of his frigid majesty. At length we came to one end of a broad hallway, which seemed shut off from the rest of the palace by a wall thickly encrusted with strings of great diamonds, each as big as a goose egg, extending from the ceiling to the floor, and turning back the shimmer of the lamps with such a flood of crystalline radiance that my eyes involuntarily closed before it. Think of my amazement when the 2 guards, laying hold of this wall of jewels, as I deemed it, drew it to the right and left till there was room for me to pass. What I had taken for a wall of jewels was but a curtain made up of round bits of ice strung upon strings and hanging like a shower of diamonds there before me, as they glittered in the light of the lamps each side of them. I now stood in the throne room of His Frigid Majesty, the King of the Koltykwerps. Now I realized that what I had seen elsewhere in his palace of ice was in reality but a sample of its magnificence. For here the splendor of King Gelidus' castle burst upon me in its fullest strength. Imagine a great round chamber lighted with the soft flames of perfumed oil, streaming from 100 alabaster lamps, the walls lined with broad divans covered with snow-white pelts, the floors thickly carpeted with the same glorious rugs, while on one side, glittering in the shimmer of the 100 massive lamps, stands the icy throne of the King of the Koltykwerps, decked with snow-white skins, and he upon it, with Schneeboule, his fair daughter, sitting at his feet, and all around and about him, group-wise, 100 Koltykwerps, the king, the princess, and the courtiers, all clad in skins whiter than the driven snow. And you, dear friends, will have some faint idea of the splendor of the scene which burst upon me as the 2 guards drew aside the strands of ice jewels at the end of the hallway in the palace of ice. Like all his subjects, King Gelidus looked out through the round window of his fur hood, just as a big, good-natured boy does through his skating cap. The Koltykwerps were not much taller than I, but were very stocky built, so that when broadened out by their thick fur suits they really took on at times the appearance of animated snowballs. It would be hard for the fingers of the deftest hand to draw faces fuller of kindliness and good nature than those of the Koltykwerps. Their small, honest grey eyes sparkled with a boniform glint, and so broad were their smiles that they were only about half visible through the round holes of their fur hoods. I was delighted with them from the very start, and the more so when I heard King Gelidus cry out in a cheery voice, "A right crisp and cold welcome to our icy court, little baron. But from what our people tell us, thou earnest a pair of hands so hot that we beg thee to take a few days to cool off before thou touchest palms with any of the Koltykwerps, and we also beg thee to be careful and not to lean against any of our richly carved panels, or to slide down any of our highly polished railings, or to handle the strands of our jewels, or sit down for any length of time on the front steps of our palace. And we make the same request of thy 4-footed companion, who is said to be of even warmer disposition than thou." I bowed and kissed my hand to his frigid majesty, and assured him that I should make every effort to lower my temperature as speedily as possible, and in the meantime that I should be extremely careful not to come into contact with any of the artistic carving of his palace of ice. As I pronounced these words, the whole company began to clap their hands, and as they did so, a cold shiver ran down my back, for there was a sound, methought, very much like the rattling of dry bones to that applause, but I took good care not to let King Gelidus notice my fright. His frigid majesty now presented me to his daughter Schneeboule, a pretty little maid of about 16 crystal winters, with cheeks round as apples, and as deeply dimpled as the furrows of a crossbun. Her eyes twinkled as she looked upon Bulger and me, and turning to her frigid papa, she asked for leave to touch the tip end of my thumb, which being done, she gave a squeaky little scream and began to blow on her tiny finger as if I had blistered it. King Gelidus also presented me to several of his court favorites, all men of the coldest blood in the nation. Their names were Jellikin, Prostiphiz, Icicle, and Glacier Boy. They were all dreadfully slow thinkers when you questioned them very closely on any subject. It didn't take me very long to discover this. In fact, they requested me to be less warm in my manner, and not to ask them any posers, as they invariably found that deep thought caused a rise in their temperature. This was, to be honest about it, very annoying to me. For you know, dear friends, what a lodestone my mind is, never asleep, always in a quiver like a mariner's compass, pointing this way and that in search of the polar star of wisdom. Upon making known my trouble to his frigid majesty, King Gelidus, he most gracefully ordered one of his trusty attendants to conduct me to the triple-walled ice cell of a certain Koltykwerp by the name of Bullibrain, that is, literally, boiling brain, a man who had been born with a hot head, and consequently with a very active brain. For 50 years King Gelidus had been doing his very best to refrigerate this subject of his, but without success, and as I was just bursting with impatience to ask a whole string of questions concerning the Koltykwerps, you may imagine how delighted I was to make the acquaintance of Bullibrain, or Lord Hothead, as he was called among the Koltykwerps. But, dear friends, you must excuse me if I make this the end of the chapter, and stop here for a brief rest. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood. Chapter 23. Lord Hothead again, and this time a fuller account of him. His wondrous tales concerning the Koltykwerps, where they came from, who they were, and how they managed to live in this world of eternal frost. The many questions I put to him, and his answers in full. Lord Bullibrain was never allowed to set foot inside the Palace of Ice. King Gelidus, backed by the opinion of his favourites, still indulged the belief that he would be able in the end to refrigerate him. True, he had been many years at the task, so that it had now become a sort of hobby of his, and almost daily did his frigid majesty pay a visit to his hot-headed subject, and test his temperature by pressing his small ball of ice against his temples. To King Gelidus's mind, a man of so high a temperature was a continual menace to the peace and quiet of his kingdom. What if Lord Hothead in a dream should wander forth some night, and fall asleep with his back against one of the walls of the ice palace? Might he not melt away enough of it to throw the whole glorious fabric into a slump and slush of debris? It was terrible to think of, when he did think of it, and he thought of it quite often. But Bullibrain held no terrors for me, nor for Bulger either. In fact, Bulger was delighted to be stroked by a warm hand, and he and Bullibrain and I soon became the very best of friends. But his frigid majesty was so alarmed when he heard of this friendship that he was seized with quite a spasm of warmth, for, thought he, the united heat of 3 hotheads might work some terrible harm to the welfare of his people. So he issued the coldest kind of decree carved on a tablet of ice, that Bullibrain and I should on no one day pass more than a half-hour together, that we should never touch palm to palm, sleep in the same room, eat from the same dish, or sit on the same divan. These regulations were annoying, but I followed them to the letter. And when King Gelidus saw how careful I was to yield the strictest obedience to his decree, he conceived a genuine affection for me, and sent several magnificent pelts to the ice house, which had been assigned to Bulger and me, for of course it would not have been safe for us to lodge in the palace itself. But his frigid majesty held out the flattering prospect that the very moment Bulger and I should become properly refrigerated, apartments in the palace would be assigned to us, and in fact that I should be permitted to eat at the royal table. Who are the Koltykwerps? Where did these strange folk come from? How did they ever find their way down into this world of eternal frost? And above all, where do they get their food and clothing from? These were a few of the questions which I was so impatient to have answered that my temperature was raised a whole degree, and I was obliged to sleep with only one single pelt between me and my divan of crystal ice. For a man bred and born in so cold a country as the land of the Koltykwerps, Bullibrain had an extremely quick and active mind. On account of his rapid heartbeat, and the consequent high temperature of his body, he was not able to do his writing on slabs of ice as other learned Koltykwerps had done, for it would not have been a pleasant thing for him to see a poem which he had just finished literally melt away in his hands, without so much as leaving an ink stain behind. so he had been obliged, with King Gelidus's permission, to do his writing on thin tablets of alabaster. Before he began to talk to me about the progenitors of the Koltykwerps, he showed me a map of the country in the upper world once inhabited by them, and traced for me the course they had sailed upon abandoning that country, and described the beautiful shores they had landed upon in their search for a new home. I saw at a glance that it was Greenland which describing, and knowing as I did that in past ages Greenland had been a land of blue skies, warm winds, green meadows, and fertile valleys, before moving mountains of ice came down from the north and crushed all life out of it, I listened with breathless interest to his wonderful tales of its beautiful lakes nestled at the foot of vine-clad mountains, all of which Bullibrain now looked upon in fair visions inherited from his ancestors. And I also knew that it must have been the Arctic Ocean, which had been traversed by the ships of the Koltykwerps, who had then landed upon the, in those days, sunny shores of northern Russia. But the mountains of ice could sail too, and they followed the fleeing Koltykwerps like mighty monsters, dashing themselves with terrible roar and crash upon the peaceful shores, which they soon transformed into a wilderness of berg, of glacier, and of floe. Only a handful of the Koltykwerps survived, and these, in their dumb despair, taking refuge in the clefts and caverns of the North Urals, could from their hiding places look upon one of the strangest sights that had ever greeted human eyes. So rapid had been the advance of these mighty masses of ice, crashing against the mountain sides, and rending the very rocks in their fury, that the air gave up its warmth, and the sun was powerless to give it back again. The animals of the wild wood, and the beasts of the field, overtaken in their flight, perished as they ran and stood there stark and stiff, with heads uptossed and muscles knotted. Then, by the thousands and 10 times thousands, the crushed crystals of the pursuing floods caught up like moss and leaves in a mountain torrent, and packed in every cave and cavern on the way, tearing broader and loftier portals into these subterranean chambers, so that they might do their work the better. And these then, O Bullibrain, are your meat quarries? I exclaimed, whence ye draw your daily food? Even so, little Baron, replied the hot-headed Koltykwerp, and not only our food, but the skins which serve us so admirably for clothing in this cold underground world, and the oil too which burns in our beautiful alabaster lamps, besides 100 other things, such as bone for hews and handles, horn for needles and buttons and eating utensils, wool for the weaving of our undergarments, and magnificent pelts of bear and seal and walrus, which laid upon our benches and divans of crystal ice, transform them into beds and couches which even an inhabitant of thy world might envy. But, O Bullibrain, I cried out, have ye not almost exhausted these supplies? Will not death from starvation soon stare ye all in the face in these deep and icy caverns of the underworld, visited by the sun's light, yet unwarmed by it? Nay, little Baron, answered Bullibrain with a smile almost as warm as one of my own. Let not that thought give thee a moment's alarm, for we have as yet barely raised the lid of this icebox of nature's packing. We are not large eaters, anyway, continued Lord Hothead. For while it is true that we are not indolent people, for his frigid majesty's palace and our dwellings need constant repair, and new hatchets and axes must be chipped out in the flint quarries, and new lamps carved, and new garments woven, yet it is also true that we take life rather easy. We have no enemies to slay, no quarrels to settle, no gold to fight over, no land to drive our fellow creatures from and fence in, nor can we be ill, if we were willing to be, for in this pure, cold, crisp air, disease would try in vain to sow her poisoned germs. Hence, needing no doctors, we have none, as we have no lawyers either, or merchants to sell us what belongs to us already. His frigid majesty is an excellent king. I never read of a better one. I doubt that his like exists in the upper world. Always cool-headed, no thought of conquest, no dreams of power, no longings for empty pomp and show ever enter his mind. Since the day his father died, and we set the great Koltykwerp crown of crystal ice upon his cool brow, his temperature has never risen but half a degree, and that was only for a brief hour or so, and was occasioned by a mad proposal of one of his counsellors, who claimed that he had discovered an explosive compound, something like the gunpowder of thy world, I fancy, by which he could shatter the glorious window of rock crystal set in the mountain dome of our underworld and let in the warm sunshine. Did his frigid majesty Gelidus put this daring Koltykwerp to death? I asked. Oh dear, no, replied Bullibrain. He merely ordered him to be refrigerated for so many hours a day, until all his feverish projects had been chilled to death. For no doubt, little Baron, a man of thy deep learning knows full well that all the ills which thy world suffers from are the children of fevered brains, of minds made restless and visionary by the high temperature of the blood which gallops through the approaches to the dome of thought, stirring up wild dreams and visions as thy son lifts the poisonous vapor from the stagnant pool. The more I listened to Bullibrain, the more I liked him. The fact of the matter is, I preferred to sit in his narrow cell with its plain walls of ice, lighted up by a single alabaster lamp, and converse with him to loitering in the splendid throne room of his frigid majesty King Gelidus. But Bulger had discovered that the pelts of Princess Schneeboule's divan were much thicker, softer, and warmer than the single one allowed Lord Hothead, and therefore he preferred spending his time with her. But fearing lest he might get into mischief, I didn't dare to leave him alone with the princess for too long at a time. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood. Chapter 24. Some few things concerning the dear little Princess Schneeboule. How she and I became fast friends, and how one day she conducted Bulger and me into her favorite grotto to see the little man with the frozen smile. Something about him. What came of my having looked upon him quite fully described. At the time of Bulger's and my arrival in the land of the Koltykwerps, the Princess Schneeboule was about 15 years of age, and I must say that rarely had it been my good fortune to make the acquaintance of such a sweet-tempered, lovable little creature. She flitted about the ice palace like a beam of sunlight, and there was nothing of the spoiled child about her, although a bit mischievous at times. Her voice was as full of music as a skylark's, and it was not many days before she and I had become the best of friends in the world. Now you must know, dear friends, that according to the law of the Koltykwerps, a princess is left absolutely free to choose her own husband, and his frigid majesty was very anxious that Schneeboule should pick hers out as soon as possible. Moreover, the law of the land gave her perfect freedom to choose a husband of high or low degree, provided he was young enough. The way in which a Koltykwerp princess was required to make known her preference was to press a kiss upon the cheek of the young man whom she might settle upon. This ennobled him at once, and he became the heir apparent to the throne of ice, and entitled to sit on its steps until he should be crowned king. Now, his frigid majesty was delighted to see this friendship spring up between Schneeboule and me, for he had hoped to make use of my influence to bring her to set the necessary kiss on some youth's cheek before I took my departure from the cold kingdom of the Koltykwerps. I gave him the word of a nobleman that I would do my best to carry out his wishes. With Schneeboule for a guide, Bulger and I often went for walks through the splendid ice grottos of her father's kingdom, selecting days when the sunlight of the outer world poured strongest through the mighty lens set in the side of the mountain. Then these grottos took on a splendor that my poor tongue is powerless to describe. Their crystal mazes glittered as if their walls were set with massive jewels, most wonderfully cut and polished, and as if their ceilings were fretted with gems so peerless that all the gold of the upper world would fall far short of paying for them. Here, there, and everywhere, the skill of the Koltykwerps had carved and chiseled graceful flights of steps, broad landings with majestic columns, and winding corridors lined with long rows of statues, single and groupwise. And ever and anon the visitor came upon a terrace where, seated upon a fur-covered divan, he might look out upon the bewildering beauty of King Gelidus' icy domains, arch touching arch, and dome springing from dome, while over and above all, through the gigantic lens in its granite setting, a mile above our heads, streamed a flood of glorious sunlight, lighting up this world within a world with a radiance so grand and so complete as to seem to be a sun of a far greater splendor than the one that warmed the upper world and bathed it in so many gorgeous hues at morn and eve. Hardly a day went by now that the princess of the Koltykwerps did not surprise either Bulger or me with some gift or other. To tell the truth, dear friends, although my Russian coat was fur-trimmed, yet I began to feel the need of warmer garments after a week's sojourn in the icy domain of King Gelidus, and I think Schneeboule must have heard my teeth chattering, for one morning, upon entering the Palace of Ice, I was delighted to be presented with a full suit of fur, precisely similar to the one worn by King Gelidus himself. Nor was Bulger forgotten by the loving little princess, for with her own hands she had knitted him a blanket of the softest wool, which she belted so snugly around his body and tied so tightly around his neck that henceforth he felt perfectly comfortable in the chill air of the home of the Koltykwerps. One day the Princess Schneeboule said to me, "Oh, come, little Baron, come to my favorite grotto. Now that the sun's rays are bright within it, there shalt thou see a wonder." "A wonder, Princess Schneeboule?" "Yes, little Baron, a wonder," she repeated. "The little man with the frozen smile." "Little man with the frozen smile?" I echoed. Come and see, little Baron," cried Schneeboule, hurrying on ahead. In a few moments we had reached the grotto and bounded into it with the princess leading the way. Suddenly she halted in front of a magnificent block of crystal ice, clear as polished glass, and cried out, "There, look! There is the little man with the frozen smile." Even now, as the thought of that moment comes over me, I feel something of the thrill of half fear, half joy, as my eyes fell upon the little creature shut in that superb block of ice, himself a part of it, himself its heart, its contents, its mystery. There in its center, in easy posture, with wide open eyes, and with what might be called a smile upon his face, that is a glint of kindliness and affection in its strange eyes, with their overhanging brows, sat a small animal of the chimpanzee race. He had possibly been asleep when the icy flood struck him, dreaming of beautiful trees bending beneath purple fruit, of cloudless skies above and a coral beach below, and death had come to him so quickly that he had become a brother to this block of ice, while the happy dream was still in his thoughts. It was wonderful. It was more than wonderful. Spellbound by the strange spectacle, I stood there, I know not how long, with my eyes looking into his. At last Schneeboule's voice aroused me. "Ha ha!" she laughed. "Look, little Baron, Bulger is trying to kiss his poor dead brother." In truth, Bulger did have his nose pressed firmly against the block of ice in his effort to scent the strange animal imprisoned in that crystal cell, so near and yet so far beyond the reach of his keen scent. "Well, little Baron," cried Schneeboule, "did I not speak truly? Have I not shown thee the little man with the frozen smile?" "Indeed thou hast, fair princess," was my reply, "and I cannot tell thee how grateful I am to thee for having done so." Then, as she plucked me by the sleeve, I pleaded, "Nay, gentle Schneeboule, not yet, not yet. Let me bide a little longer. The little man with the frozen smile seems to beg me not to go. I can almost imagine that I hear him whisper, 'Oh, little Baron, break open the crystal cell of my prison and take me with thee back to the world of sunshine, back to the land of the orange tree, where the soft warm winds used to rock me to sleep in the cradle of the swaying boughs, while the wise and watchful patriarch of our flock stood guard over us all." Schneeboule's big, round, grey eyes filled with tears at these words. "Would that he were alive, little Baron," she murmured, "and that I could give him some of my happiness to pay him back for all the long years he has been spending in his icy prison." In a few moments Schneeboule took me by the hand and led me away from the great block of ice with its silent prisoner. My heart was very heavy, and both Schneeboule and Bulger did their utmost to divert me, but all to no purpose. Leaving the princess at the portal of the palace, I went to my dwelling, which was ablaze with the soft glow of its alabaster lamps, and there I found a beautiful new pelt spread over my divan, a new gift from King Gelidus, but I could take no pleasure in it. My thoughts were all with the little man with the frozen smile, locked in the icy embrace of that crystal mould, which, in its cold irony, let him seem to be so free and unfettered, and yet held him in such vice-like grip. After a while I dismissed my serving people and laid me down for the night with my dear Bulger nestled against my breast. But I could not sleep. All night long, those strange eyes with their uncanny glint followed me about, pleading strong but silent for me to come again, for me to soften my heart like a child of the sunshine that I was, to shatter his crystal dungeon and set him loose, to bear him away from the icy domain of the Koltykwerps out into the warm air of the upper world. What was I dreaming about? Was he not dead? Had not his spirit left his body thousands and thousands of years ago? Why should I let such wild thoughts vex my mind? What good would come of it? None whatsoever. I was a reasonable creature. I must not give lodgment within my brain to such silly ideas. The little man with the frozen smile had been, through almost playful fate, laid away in a beautiful tomb. I must not disturb it. No doubt in his lifetime he had been the pet of a noble manor, brought to the Northland from some sunny clime by master of powerful argosy. Let him rest in peace. I must not dare to mar the beauty of his crystal tomb, so gloriously transparent. I was even sorry that Schneeboule had led me into her beautiful grotto, and resolved to go thither no more. What poor weak creatures we are, so fertile in good resolutions, and yet so unfruitful of results, planting whole acres with fair promises, but when the tender shoots pierce the ground, turning our back upon the crop as if it didn't belong to us. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood. Chapter 25. A sleepless night for Bulger and me, and what followed it. Interview with King Gelidus. My request and his reply. What all took place when I learned that the king and his counselors had decided not to grant my request. Strange tumult among the Koltykwerps, and how his frigid majesty stilled it, and some other things. Not only had I been unable to sleep, but by my tossing about I had kept poor dear Bulger awake, so that when morning came we both looked haggard enough. I felt as if I had been through a fit of sickness, and no doubt he did too. At any rate, I had no appetite for the heavy meat diet of the Koltykwerps, and seeing me refuse my breakfast, Bulger did likewise. I had promised Schneeboule to come early to the palace, for she had a number of questions which she wished to ask me concerning the upper world. "Good morning, little Baron," she cried in her sweetest tones as I entered the throne room. "Didst sleep well last night on the new pelt which Papa sent thee?" I was about to make a reply when Schneeboule's hand, coming in contact with mine, for we had both removed our gloves in order to shake hands, she uttered a piercing scream, and drawing back stood there blowing her breath on her right palm as she exclaimed again and again, "Firebrand! Firebrand!" In an instant King Gelidus and a group of his counselors drew near, and pulling over their gloves, one after the other, laid his hand in mine. "Glowing coals!" cried his frigid majesty. "Tongue of flame!" roared Frosty Fizz. "Boiling water!" groaned Glacier Boy. "Red hot!" hissed Icicle. "Thou must leave the palace at once," half pleaded King Gelidus. "It would simply be madness for me to permit such a firebrand to remain within the walls of the royal residence. The intense heat of thy body would be sure to melt a hole in its wall ere the sun goes down." The royal councillors again drew off their gloves and laid hands upon poor Bulger, when a second alarm even wilder than the first was sent up, and we were hastily escorted back to our lodging house. No doubt, dear friends, you will be somewhat mystified upon reading these words, but the explanation is easy. Owing to worriment and lack of sleep, Bulger and I had awakened in a highly feverish condition, and to the Koltykwerps we had really seemed to be almost on fire. but our fever left us toward night, hearing which King Gelidus sent for us, and did all in his power to entertain us with song and dance, in both of which Schneeboule was very skilled. Finding that his frigid majesty was in such a rosy humour, if I may be allowed to speak that way of a person whose face was almost as white as the alabaster lamps over his head, I determined to ask him for permission to cleave asunder the icy cell of the little man with the frozen smile, and ascertain, if possible, from the collar, which, made up apparently of gold and silver coin, was clasped around his neck, to whom he had belonged and where his home had been. No sooner had I preferred my request than I noticed that the white face of the royal Gelidus parted with its smile and took on a terribly icy look. Methought I could look through the tip of his nose as though an icicle, and methought too that his ears shone in the light of the alabaster lamps like sheets of crystal ice, and that his voice as he spoke puffed into my face like the first flakes of a coming snowstorm. I quickly repented me of my rash action, but it was too late, and I determined to stand by it. "Little Baron," spoke royal Gelidus in icy tones, "never a heartbeat in a kingly breast that was purer and colder than mine, freer from the warmth of selfishness, with not a single hot corner for its ire or anger to nestle in, or for weakness or folly to make their hiding places. For thousands of years my people have inhabited this icy domain, and breathed this pure cold air, and never yet hath one desired to strike an axe of flint into the walls of that crystal prison. However, little Baron, there may be some warm corner in my heart wherein cold and limpid wisdom may not be at home. Therefore come to me tomorrow for my answer. Meanwhile, I'll take counsel with the coolest brains and coldest hearts about me. If they see no harm in thy request, thou mayest crack open the crystal gates that have for so many centuries shut the man-like creature in his silent cell, and take him forth in order to study the mystic words graven on his collar, but upon the strict condition that in cleaving open his house of crystal my quarrymen so apply their wedges of flint as to break the block into 2 equal pieces, that when thou hast read what may be there, the 2 parts be closed upon the little man again, edge fitting edge like a perfect mould, so exactly that to the eye no sign of line or joint be visible. Dost promise, little Baron, that this shall be as to our royal will it seems meet that it should be?" I promised most solemnly that the crystal cell of the little man with the frozen smile should be opened and closed exactly as his frigid majesty had directed. It would be hard for me to tell you, dear friends, how happy I went to rest that night upon my icy divan, and how, as the tiny flame of my alabaster lamp shed its soft glow upon the walls of ice, I lay there turning over in my mind the strange and mysterious pleasure which was soon to fall to my lot when the quarrymen of King Gelidus should send their wedges of flint in this glorious block of ice and cleave it asunder. Even Don Fum, master of masters, had never dreamed of receiving a message from the people who lived in the very childhood of the world, and in anticipation already I enjoyed the splendid triumph which would be mine when I came to lecture before the learned societies upon the mysterious lettering on the curious collar clasping the neck of the little man with the frozen smile. Imagine my anguish then, dear friends, upon receiving a message from King Gelidus the next day that his councillors had with one voice decreed against the opening of the crystal prison which stood in Schneeboule's grotto. I was as if smitten with some sudden and awful ailment. I had never felt until that moment how keen the tooth of disappointment could be. I shivered first with a chill that made me brother to the Koltykwerps, and then I burned with a fever so raging that a wild rumour spread through Gelidus's icy domain that I was setting fire to the very walls and roof. With wild outcries and faces drawn with nameless dread, the subjects of his frigid majesty rushed pell-mell up the wide flights of stairs leading to the palace of ice, and pleaded for the king to show himself. In cold and frigid majesty, Gelidus walked out upon the platform and listened to the prayers of his people. "We shall burn!" they cried. "Our beautiful homes will fall about our ears. These crystal steps will melt away, and all these fair columns and arches and statues and pedestals will turn to water and empty themselves into the lower caverns of the earth. The great window of our sky will fall with awful crash upon our heads, putting an end forever to this fair domain of crystal splendor. Oh, Gelidus, haste thee, ere it be too late. Let the little baron have his way before bitter disappointment transforms his body and limbs into tongues of flame to lick up this magnificent palace in a single night, and dash its 1,000 alabaster lamps to the ground, a heap of shards, no fragment matching its brother fragment, but all a wretched mass of worthless matter. King Gelidus and his frosty counsellors saw that it would be useless to attempt to reason with the people, and therefore turning toward them, he coldly waved his chilly right hand, and with an icy smile spoke frostily as follows: "Go, Coltiquerps, to your homes, and be happy. What think you? Have I a heated brain? Doth my heart steam with foolishness, that you should think me capable of wishing harm to the tiniest Coltiquerp that spins his top of ice in my fair kingdom? Go to your homes, I say. The little baron is already cooling off, for he hath my full consent to cleave asunder the crystal prison of the little man with the frozen smile. There is nothing to be frightened about, my children. So eat hearty suppers and sleep soundly tonight, for my royal word for it, by tomorrow morning the little baron will cease to be the least bit dangerous to the peace and welfare of our icy kingdom. A good cold night to you all." In a short half-hour the panic-stricken Coltiquerps were all back in their homes again, and when a messenger came from King Gelidus to measure my temperature, he found such a great improvement that he opened his chilly heart and sent me a beautiful present from his treasure house, to wit, a small block of ice, clearer than any gem I had ever seen, in the heart of which lay a glorious red rose in fullest bloom, each velvet petal opened out eagerly. Upon consulting my diary, I found that it was just 6 months to a day since I had left Castle Trump and the loved ones sheltered by its time-worn tiles, and cold as was the covering of this thrice beautiful child of the upper world, I clasped it to my breast and shed tears. And this was the way it came about, dear friends, that King Gelidus and his frosty counsellors were brought to give their consent to my cleaving asunder the icy prison wherein lay the little man with the frozen smile. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood. Chapter 26. How the quarrymen of King Gelidus cleft asunder the crystal prison of the little man with the frozen smile. My bitter disappointment and how I bore it. Wonderful happenings of the night that followed. Bulger again proves himself to be an animal of extraordinary sagacity. Bulger and I had little appetite for the dainty breakfast of stewed sweetbreads which the Coltiquerps set before us next morning, for I knew, and he half suspected, that something important was going to happen, being nothing less than the cleaving asunder of the crystal cell which had held the little chimpanzee a prisoner for so many centuries. Walking beside the merry Princess Schneeboule, who was delighted to know that his frigid majesty, her father, had at last yielded to my wishes, Bulger and I set out for the beautiful ice grotto. Behind us walked Frosty Fizz and Glacier Boy, with instructions from the king to supervise the cleaving asunder of the block of ice, and after them came 4 of King Gelidus's quarrymen, 2 bearing flint axes with helves of polished bone, and 2 carrying the flint wedges to be used in the work. We soon entered Schneeboule's grotto, and the task was at once entered upon. It seemed to me I could almost see the little man with the frozen smile wink his eyelids as the quarrymen set their wedges in place and began to mark the line of fracture. But of course, dear friends, you know what imagination I have, especially when I get worked up over anything. So you must take what I say sometimes with a grain of salt, although, as a rule, you may accept my statements with childlike confidence. With such wonderful skill did the Coltiquerpian quarrymen use their axes and wedges that in a few moments, to my great delight, the huge block of ice fell asunder in perfect halves, in one of which the little man-like creature lay on his side like a casting in a mould. I made haste to lift him out and wrap him in a soft pelt which I had brought along for that purpose, and then I turned to retrace my steps to my chamber, where I intended to begin at once my study of whatever inscription should be found upon his curious collar. "Remember, little Baron," said Glacier Boy, "by express command of his frigid majesty, the little man with the frozen smile must be returned to his crystal cell tomorrow morning at this very hour." I bowed assent, and then, having accompanied Princess Schneeboule as far as the bottom of the grand staircase leading to the Ice Palace, I turned away and was soon in the privacy of my own apartment. Now came for me one of the bitterest disappointments of my life, but I submitted with a good grace, for it was fit punishment visited upon me for my foolish vanity in striving to unearth some older record of the human race than had yet been done by any of the great searchers and philosophers, not even excepting that master of masters, Don Strephalophysiquinarius Fum. Know then, dear friends, that the quaint collar, made up of gold and silver coins or discs, cunningly linked together, which encircled the animal's neck, contained not a single word or letter of any language, the undersides being quite blank, and the upper merely having rough carved outlines of an object which might possibly have been intended for the sun. Wrapping the animal up in the soft pelt, I laid him away in the corner of my divan, and betook myself to the palace of his frigid majesty, where I frankly informed King Gelidus of my great disappointment in not finding some few words, or even a single word, of a language unknown to the wisest heads of the upper world. Schneeboule was so touched by my sadness, that had I not skilfully kept out of her way, I verily believe she would have thrown her arms around my neck and imprinted upon my cheek the kiss which would have made me the king of the Koltykwerps. But I had no longing to spend the rest of my life in the icy domains of his frigid majesty, even though my brow would be crowned with the cold crown of the Koltykwerp. If I had been an old man, with slow and feeble pulse, it would have been very different, but my heart was too warm and my blood too hot to fill such a position with agreeableness to myself, or satisfaction to the people of this icy underworld. So I kept the little princess busy enough, I can assure you, first with songs, then with dance, and then with storytelling. That night King Gelidus ordered a magnificent fete to be held in my honor. 500 more alabaster lamps were lighted, and the royal divans were laid with the richest pelts in the palace, and after the dancing and singing had ended, frozen tidbits from the royal kitchen were passed around on alabaster salvers, and Bulger and I ate until our teeth ached. It was late when we reached our own apartment, and so full were my thoughts of the beautiful sights which we had gazed upon in the throne room, that I had quite forgotten about the poor little man with the frozen smile, whom I had covered up and tucked away on my divan. But Bulger had not been so hard-hearted. 20 times during the evening he had given me a sly tug at my sleeve, as much as to say, "Come, little master, let's hurry back. Dost not remember that we left my poor little frozen brother tucked away in that icy chamber all alone by himself?" I was very weary, and I fell off to sleep almost immediately, and yet I had an indistinct recollection that Bulger was not in his place against my breast. I remembered feeling for him, but that's all. It never flashed upon me that he had gone and lain down beside the poor little stranger, whom I had so unfeelingly lifted from his last resting place. And yet such must have been the case, for about midnight, it seemed to me, I was awakened by a gentle tugging at my sleeve. It was my faithful Bulger, but half awake and half asleep as I was, I merely thought that he was only asking for a caress, as was often his wont when he fell a-thinking about home. So I reached out and stroked his head several times and dropped off again. But the tugging began anew, and this time 'twas more vigorous, and with it came an impatient whine, which meant, "Come, come, little master, rouse thee. Dost suppose I would break thy rest unless there was good reason for it?" I didn't need a third reminder, but with a single bound landed on my feet, and reaching out for one of the tiny tapers which the Koltykwerps make use of as lighters, I carried the flames from the single lamp burning on the wall to the 3 others hanging here and there. The icy walls of my chamber were now ablaze with light. There sat Bulger on the fur-covered divan, beside the place where the little man with the frozen smile lay hidden under the pelt. His tail was wagging nervously, and his large lustrous eyes were fixed first upon me, and then upon the covering of his dead brother, with an expression I never remembered having seen in them before. And then, with a sudden movement, he laid hold of the pelt, and, drawing it aside, showed me, what think you, dear friends? What, I ask in a tone of half whisper, half gasp, for now, years after, I still can feel that wonderful thrill which I felt then. Why, it was alive! That ape-like creature had come to life after his sleep of thousands of years in that narrow crystal cell. Bulger had lain down beside his frozen brother and warmed him back to life again. Oh, it was wondrously wonderful to see that pair of little eyes, bead-like in brightness, look up and blink at me. And then to hear that low, moaning voice, so human-like, as if it whimpered, with a shake and a shiver. Oh, how cold it is! How very cold it is! Where's the sun? Where's the soft warm wind? And where are the cloudless skies so blue, oh, so beautifully blue, that used to hang over my head? Bidding Bulger to lie down again beside him and snuggle up as close as possible, I made haste to cover them both with the softest skins I could find. In a few moments there came from underneath the pile a low, contented cry of "Hooja, hooja, hooja," followed by a curious addition sounding like "fuff, fuff, fuff." So I put them all together and named the strange newcomer to the icy domain of King Gelidus Fuffcoojah. Sleep any more that night? Not a wink. The same joy came over me that I used to feel on Christmas morning long ago, when Kris Kringle brought me some wonderful bit of mechanism moved by a secret spring. For I always scorned to accept ordinary toys like ordinary children. And oh, how I longed for the morning when it would be time for me to bundle up the little man. No longer him with the frozen smile, but Fuffcoojah, the live boy from far away, with his curious little face screwed up into such a funny look, and carry him to the palace. How delighted Schneeboule will be, thought I, and King Gelidus too, how he will unbend from his frigid majesty as he watches the antics of Fuffcoojah, and how pleased all the dignified Koltykwerpians, including Frostyphiz and Glacier Boy, will be when I tell them that the little man with the frozen smile has come to life again. What crowds of Koltykwerps, men, women, and children will rush up the long flights of steps leading to the ice palace, begging and entreating King Gelidus to let them have just a little look at Fuffcoojah, the little man set free from his icy cell by the famous traveller, Baron Sebastian von Trump. End of chapter 26.